When I moved out of my childhood home and into a somewhat underwhelming apartment, I had a big question to ask myself. How will I watch television? In my previous domain, I had access to hundreds of channels, any episode of King of the Hill I desired, recorded on my DVR for future consumption. But now, the king was gone, and I had to decide whether signing up for satellite TV again would be worth it. It wasn't. So I signed up for Hulu and Netflix and never looked back. That's how it usually goes nowadays. The people that are moving out for the first time don't really see a need for traditional TV packages. In a few decades, satellite and cable television will be antiquated things of the past. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't appreciate how we got here, since the dynamic between streaming services, traditional television, and content creation sites like YouTube and Twitch are undeniably linked. Let's look at the history of television. This magical technology has been around for a century in some form, but the early days were rough. Radio was revolutionary, and the next step seemed to be to bring the movie theater experience home. But it would take a lot of invention and innovation to get to a point where the general public would say, "Oh, I get it." Normally I'd cover the in-depth technical history of this television, but honestly, it's not too integral to the video as a whole. I mean, much of this early tech is obsolete and evolved pretty quickly. So to make it short and sweet, several inventors wanted to find a way to transmit video along with audio, and there were a few ways to do this. One way, which actually gained some traction, was a mechanical television. Lights would be beamed through spinning discs, and as you can imagine, it didn't look great. Low detailed silhouettes shine through an archaic-looking box. It was a challenge to even see what was happening on screen. Obviously, the public didn't see much use for something like this. After all, it looked like garbage. But it was early days, and no real standard for something like video transmissions existed. Other developments saw what we would consider now more practical technologies. Cathode rays and tubes, technical stuff, again, I won't get into. But this cool stuff made it so that by the 1930s you could have a TV in your house. It was over $10,000, sure, but again, you gotta start somewhere. Now TV only really works if you have something to show on the screen, so in 1932 the BBC began having regular broadcasts, albeit with incredibly poor picture quality. Not just low resolution, it was like 30 lines that were displayed vertically. For comparison, a standard 1080p image has, well, 1080 vertical lines. This was 30p resolution. Boy, do we have it good today. Luckily for all of us, it got better over the next few years, but the tech was still rather niche. It was seen as a novelty device for the rich, and most of the general public were very much content with the radio. The growth TV was seeing was small, and things weren't looking much better when the war started. The BBC was worried that frequencies used for broadcasts could give away key positions to the enemy, or something like that. So they stopped programming once war broke out. Television was niche, but not unheard of to the masses. Tech demos showed it off at fairs and shows, but it was pretty uninteresting to most. They saw it as something pretty pointless for the price, and few could see a future where the general public would want such a thing. This is a widespread mentality with most technologies, to be honest. I remember when I was in school and my teacher wrote off the announcement of the iPhone with the simple, "Who would ever buy that?" Yeah, in early days of any tech, this sort of discourse occurs. But things do change. By the 1940s, TV stations were popping up in the States. It started with very limited tests to specific local areas at first, but the scale of broadcasts quickly grew. Content on all stations wasn't really what we expect today. Most shows were just classical music and brief news reports. With the war still in swing, investment in entertainment wasn't a priority. It was obvious that the true advent of television would have to wait its turn. But of course, the war ended. The economy would recover from the Great Depression, and with soldiers returning from battle, broadcasters would be willing to invest more in entertainment. This was very apparent in 1947, when the World Series was broadcast with a multiple camera setup. Average Joes would gather at the pubs and the streets just to catch a glimpse of the game. And how? The way the cameras would cut to the action arguably gave those watching television a better view than those who actually went to the game. and the general public began to warm up to the glowing light of television. The infrastructure to broadcast new, enthralling content was growing as well. It was unfeasible for a network to operate a station in every city across the US, so instead an independent party would start a station and agree contractually to abide by one of the big network's rules. The affiliate gets content to show, and the network has a wider audience. As with any media device, as more people buy it, the excitement from content creators grows, as does the quality. The late 1940s and 50s would see the kinds of TV broadcasts vary in a much greater degree than the decade prior. Now you could see game shows, cooking shows, kid shows, and of course, sitcoms. TVs were getting cheaper, and the sales numbers reacted accordingly. From this span of the late 40s to 50s, the sales of TVs went from 1 million to over 40 million. It quickly went from a niche to necessity in the span of a decade. Before the 50s, all broadcasts were in black and white, but that wasn't much of an issue for most people. It was just the way things were. Color TV was first broadcast in 1951, but it didn't mean everybody had access to it. Sets offering the technology were incredibly expensive, and very few programs took advantage of the tech. It wasn't until 1954 that any primetime show was broadcast in color in the US. But over time, the tech got cheaper, and by the 70s, very few stations at all were broadcasting black and white content. Well, in the US. It really varies based on country, and some didn't even receive color TV transmissions until the 80s. But that's enough of that. Let's return to the 50s, where most TVs were still, well, this. By this point, TV was seen much as people would say, see video games today. It was popular, but purely for enjoyment. More serious content, like the news, was not seen as on the same level as the radio or the papers. News broadcasts would be short, at about 15 minutes long. Mostly just the basic day-to-day happenings and whatnot. It wasn't captivating the nation quite like other news mediums, but that was to change. Over time, the public would gather round and see pretty big events on their old TV. Political debates, Senate hearings here in the States, and of course the moon landing. Over the course of the 60s, TV became cemented as something not just for entertainment, but the easiest way to distribute information to the general public. By the 70s, nightly news was incredibly popular and considered must-see TV. But the quality of other television programs was increasing as well. Now shows were dealing with more serious topics and more fleshed-out storylines. Watching TV at night became the standard for nightly activities. You had hours of shows and comedies that viewers couldn't get enough of. In some ways, it was hard to see how it could get better, but it did. The mid-70s brought about a new level of technological innovation in television. While in the past you could only watch specific shows and movies when the networks wanted to show you them, there were developments that would allow people to watch whatever they wanted when they wanted. Kind of. New home video storage formats, such as Laserdisc, Betamax, and of course VHS, were hitting the market. Now some formats predated these three, but these were the three that really had the most promise, and they took off. VHS and Betamax would allow you to record television broadcasts and watch them at a later date. Laserdisc, on the other hand, allowed you to purchase movies and watch them whenever you wanted. All of these formats had significant followings in their heyday. The ability to record TV and rewatch it later meant that you didn't have to rush home to make sure you saw that next episode of Taxi. And obviously, being able to watch the movies you wanted to, when you wanted to, shifted the dynamic between film and television. Now, at first, movie studios were scared of these new formats. Would people still go and see movies at theaters if they could watch them later at home? Would this destroy the film industry with this new level of convenience? These fears meant that early progress was slow, so at first only a few studios offered to put films on the formats. By the time studios warmed up to the new format, they priced films at exorbitant prices, like $80. Now most people didn't want to spend $80 on a film, especially in 1980s dollars. But the desire to access these films at home was momentous, and demand for this product captivated the entrepreneur in all of us. This is where we would see rental stores pop up. You could rent a movie for a few nights instead of dropping $80 flat, and over the course of a few rentals, the stores would make their money back. This opened up a whole new era of television, where consumers began to seek out the easiest ways to access the content they wanted, the moment they wanted, a trend that would define the products and services that we see succeed to this day. People had options of what to watch, and this change would not be reversed. On another note, content that was broadcast over the air for the past few decades was held to pretty strict censorship standards. there is quite a lot of odd rules and regulations, and something as simple as a woman being pregnant in a show was deemed risque early on in television's life. But by the 80s, the grip of these rules were loosening, and more content could push the line. Think about The Simpsons. When it first aired, it was considered wildly controversial. Of course, now it seems very tame by comparison, but things were very different back then. And content that pushed the line was very popular. Stuff that didn't gravitate towards the norm. And nothing catered to this better than the arrival of cable and satellite TV. With these services, you would have more than just a few select channels. You would have hundreds of channels. Pay-per-view like HBO, channels for specific interests like MTV, Nick, Disney, you get the point. And all of this could be recorded on your VHS. Over time, the price of video cassettes dropped. You could go to a store and buy both films and blank tapes without emptying your wallet. And this was a big shakeup to the major networks. For the first time, they had sizable competition coming from both cable and VHS. Even with so many options out there, the mass public still tuned in. It seemed like the industry of television had stabilized. Everything had its place, new advancements gave consumers options, but enough of the consumer base was still watching TV in the same old way they always had. Shows like Seinfeld would bring in massive chunks of the populace every week, enticing enough people to watch it live. Sure, the market was diverse in scope, and there were a lot of more players in the game, but the market hadn't been destroyed by all these new offerings. DVDs would soon hit the market and give us better picture quality than VHS, but surely we still wanted to record the season premiere of Frasier. But as the 21st century approached, new tech would alter the landscape of entertainment forever. And these changes were some much of the existing market couldn't bounce back from. Enter 1999, CES. That's the Consumer Electronics Show for the uninitiated. A newfangled device makes headlines and promises to shake the broadcast industry to its core. This is the DVR. In function, it's much like a VHS, but in its convenience, it's unparalleled. Instead of putting a tape in, setting a time after checking the TV guide, you would have a TV guide more or less installed on the device. You can browse through all the shows on all the networks and record them straight to a hard drive. It can even automatically skip ads, although that feature would be deemed illegal for the next 10 years or so. More or less, the live television schedule could have no bearing on when you actually watch TV. And unlike VHS tapes, the quality wouldn't degrade over rewinding and pausing and re-recording. This worried networks. This made it so people could feasibly never tune in again live, and on those re-recordings, they wouldn't even see a glimpse of those valuable ads. But early on, the networks managed to make it work. It wasn't as widespread and cheap as VHS was, and many people were content in their ways. The rental market would be affected greatly by new services like Netflix, which would allow you to order DVDs online, which would be delivered over the mail quickly and without late fees. As time went on, DVRs became part of cable packages, and sports options would get viewers to fork out hundreds. TV was still king for now, and those in charge found ways to keep people interested. The only true competition was in its infancy, and its potential wasn't even close to being realized. This was online video, and it had been around to limited success. Poor video quality and bad internet connections, along with the general lack of content, really left it in a novelty category. But then Netflix began streaming video online. At first, it didn't leave the impact you would expect. Granted, it still suffered from bad load times and a really lackluster catalog, but it showed promise. Internet bandwidth really held back a lot of these early initiatives. YouTube was also starting up, but the last thing anybody called it was a TV competitor. Until it was. Now, in the 2010s, everything changes. It all came about pretty quickly. The smartphone let people watch things on the go. As cellular data went from 2G to 3G to 4G, home Wi-Fi was getting better, and TV packages were as expensive as ever. Netflix eventually got more content. Hulu came around, giving more options to the public with a bigger focus on television shows. And YouTube's introduction of practical monetization allowed the birth of full-time creators. And it all happened in just a few years. Now we're in the late 2010s, well, at least when this video was recorded. People that are moving out for the first time aren't giving cable companies hundreds of dollars a month anymore, because, well, why would they? Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, it all became not just supplementary, but the entire television experience. And since the early 2010s, even more arguably outlandish services arose. Twitch was seen as a strange idea that catered to few, and now it's rising to the peak of pop culture. Speaking of, if you want to watch me stream and talk about pointless stuff, check me out on Twitch. But anyway, just go and ask somebody in their 20s or early 30s if they have satellite or cable. I bet you would be hard-pressed to find a single one. The benefits surely don't outweigh the costs. It's not to say television is gone, because obviously people still watch it, but the younger demographics are unwilling to go back to the antiquated methods. DVR, even with auto ad skip, can't compete with Netflix binge watching. Convenience won out. Sports are still primarily on television, and only recently have been going to other sites. Well, it just so happens interest in many conventional sports is down for the younger generation. This could do with the fact it's harder to watch sports without a traditional TV service, or maybe people just have lower attention spans. The reason doesn't matter too much though, since it solidifies the idea that even the most popular aspects of broadcast television are losing popularity. The networks are trying to adapt. Online services with exclusive content, sometimes putting certain sports games on Twitter even. But this will likely not work. Because right now, people are content with Netflix, with Hulu, with YouTube. And content on network television, especially, has seen a considerable drop-off in quality in the past decade or so. Not saying all shows are bad, but certainly much of the talent pool has left this part of the industry. So what's the point here? I don't mean to kick TV while it's down. In fact, it's the opposite. I mean, I'm not saying you should go get Dish and watch The Big Bang Theory, but I think it's important to look back at how all these new video services came around. Even though many of us aren't watching TV like people used to, it doesn't mean that the effects of those times aren't intrinsically linked to today. The entire concept of 30-minute narratives, visual media in the home, even this video you're watching right now, it all comes from the impact of broadcast television. In a way, it hasn't died, but instead transformed. More content by more people and more choices. The pool of talent that makes that show you love on Netflix would have worked for NBC if we were in a different time. It's nice to know that the legacy of television isn't lost, since watching videos is as popular as it's ever been. So what will happen to old television? The big three, the satellite TV providers, will they just disappear? Not for a while. They still have time to learn and change before their core consumer base shifts away. But in the meantime, we can appreciate the modern age of television. More content than ever before, and more accessible than we ever dreamed. The age where we all sit around the TV at 8 o'clock to check out what happens to the gang at Cheers are long gone. But you can still watch it on Netflix. This is Tyler of Knowledge Hub.